Hello everybody. I'd like you to just think about this question for a few minutes. If you were to go back 500 years ago, to about the year 1500 or so, what do you think would be the really big stories in the world at that time? What are the really big events? I suspect one of them would probably be a guy named Christopher Columbus hopping into a boat and going to try to find India. But he didn't find India, he ran into the North American continent and discovered that there was a whole other culture and a whole other group of people living on this continent that they didn't even know about. That was a big story. Another big story would have been Henry VIII and his problems with producing a male heir. He wanted a male so that that person would be King of England, but he couldn't seem to produce one, and he went through several wives before he died and never did produce a male heir. So that would be a big story. There's lots of others too, but those would be some of them. Now think about this question. 500 years from now, in the year 2500, when historians look back at our period of time, particularly the last 10 or 20 years of our lives, what do you think they're going to say are the most important news events of this period? I suspect 500 years from now, when they look back, one of them will be the whole climate change debate. It's not a debate, the whole climate change problem, I guess is a better way to put it. They're going to look back and say, wow, in 2015, all the nations of the world came together in the United Nations and formed the Paris Climate Accord. They agreed to limit greenhouse gases and to look after Mother Earth. Isn't that incredible? Either that, or they're going to look back and say, what the hell were they thinking? Didn't they realize what was going on? I'm hoping that in the next few days that climate change treaty will be ratified, and the nations of the world will then start implementing it. Because, boy, it's about time. We've lost a lot of years with Canada and the United States dragging their feet, and it becomes increasingly important every year that we get doing something, because it's very serious. It's the most serious problem we've got in the world right now. So that's what they're going to be. That's another going to be a big story 500 years from now when they look back 500 years from now at this period of time. I suspect another story that's going to be big 500 years from now when they look back at us is that they're going to look back and say that's the period of time where they were mapping the human genome. And that's a huge story too. Boy, that's going to be important. One of the things that comes up there is this kind of a question. Why are we who we are? How did you become who you are? There are three possibilities here. Our personalities, our values, and even our IQs are shaped almost exclusively by our parents. In other words, it's our nurture that makes the difference. Or, B, we inherit a batch of genes that determine our individual behavior and our nature as human beings. It's our nature, our genetic code, that makes all the difference. Or C, our genes and our environment, nature and nurture, both determine who we become. So of all those three possibilities, if you chose C, you'd be right on the money, because that's what's happening here. Our genes and our environment both determine who we become. So the genetic genome mapping will be a huge story 500 years from now. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the science of epigenetics, but epigenetics is an incredibly important science that's relatively new. It really got going about 10 or 15 years ago, and it's changing everything. It's really the study of how the environment can affect which genes get turned on and which genes don't get turned on in our genetic code. 99% of your DNA is identical to everybody else in the world. Did you realize that 99% of your DNA is identical to Donald Trump? What a difference 1% makes, eh? 98.4% of your DNA is identical to a chimpanzee, which kind of explains a little bit about Donald Trump probably too. Before you get too excited about that, realize that 30% of your DNA is identical to lettuce. Just because you got the genes for something doesn't mean that that is your destiny. You might have the genes for alcoholism, you might have the genes for certain mental illnesses, for obesity and all those other kinds of genes, but if you're not in the environment that you need to get those genes turned on, those genes will probably never get turned on. So that's because you seem to have genetic markers for a lot of different things in your life, but whether or not those genes ever get turned on, it depends on the environment that you have. And that study of that is epigenetics. If you were to go into any cell in your body and take out the strand of DNA that's in the nucleus of those cells and unravel it, you'll find that it's about 3.5 feet long, and on that strand of DNA are about 25,000 genes. Around that strand of DNA and around all those genes is a coating, and the coating is the on-off switch for each of those 25,000 genes. And the epigenetics science really is just all about how those genes are influenced by that coating. How do those genes get turned on? How do genes not get turned on by that coating that's around the genes, the whole big long string of DNA? And that science of DNA and epigenetics is rewriting the rules of disease, heredity, and identity in our world. This fellow has done a lot of really interesting work with mice. He has tested the diet in mice. He believed that a chemical in their food was causing these mice to be fat and yellow, like the one on the left in this picture. So he took BPA out of their diet 2 weeks before the female mice got pregnant. They got pregnant, had their children, and when those children were born, all of the mice were born brown and thin, like the one on the right in this picture. And so he realized that BPA was the factor that was making them yellow and fat. So epigenetics has done some incredible things. Incidentally, they've done some really interesting work. In 2014, they found that what happens when a woman is pregnant, the food that she eats and the things that happen to her when she's pregnant, can not only affect the baby, but they can also affect her grandchildren and which genes are expressed in them. They found that whatever the mother eats when she's pregnant can not only affect her kids, but they can also affect her grandchildren and which genes get turned on, whether or not diabetes shows up in her grandchildren. So that's pretty darn exciting and pretty darn scary in a lot of ways too. So if you're pregnant, for goodness sakes, be careful. You know, there are all kinds of things that are coming across here that really are scary when you look at epigenetics. You got to be darn careful when you're pregnant to realize that everything you do can affect the baby. I was at UBC, but at the University of Saskatchewan, taking a tour of the veterinary medicine building down there, and one of the scientists came up and said that they had done some work there because they were interested in knowing why there were so many sheep were born with cyclopses in Saskatchewan, in that area around Saskatoon. So they decided to check it out. They thought it was something in the environment that was causing this, because there was no genetic thing that they could find for that. So they thought it was environmental. One of the things they found was that a lot of these sheep that were born cyclopses lived in a certain area where the sheep ate a lot of skunk cabbage. It's a weed that grows by the side of the road out there. Anyway, they found out that if the mother eats skunk cabbage between the 7th and 9th hours on the 14th day of her pregnancy, the baby will be born as cyclops. If she eats it between the 15th and the 16th hours, no problem. But between those 2 hours on that particular day, if she eats skunk cabbage, the baby is born as cyclops. It was that exact. So that's just one example of epigenetics and how whatever you do when you're pregnant can make a huge difference. This is Dr. Bob Hare from the University of British Columbia, who is one of the world's leading experts on psychopathology. He's the fellow that developed the Hare psychopathy checklist, which they use to test out whether somebody is psychopathic. He found that in Canada, about 1 out of 100 people are psychopathic. 2/3 of them are men. They're attracted to certain professions. I checked out all the professions that you folks work in, and none of you is in one of those professions that attract psychopaths. what he says is that there are certain groups, for instance, CEOs of corporations. Um, one of them is stockbrokers. He says he's quite happy to work at Mascouy Penitentiary, where he finds about 25% of the prison population at Mascouy is psychopathic, so he uses them for subjects. But he said if he couldn't work at Mascouy, he'd be quite happy to work at the Vancouver Stock Exchange, where the percentage is about the same. Another one that's really huge is television evangelists. There's many of those folks are psychopathic. It's not hard to understand when you watch some of them operate, how, you send me money and you'll get rich. God will bless you with a bunch of money if you send me money. Well, guess what? He gets rich and you get poor. That's the way that thing works. So anyway, those folks they're a little short on a conscience. And so we would call them psychopathic because they don't have empathy for the people that they're hurting. So Dr. Hare wanted to find out what causes psychopathology. He's written a very interesting book called Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work. And this talks, and one of the large numbers of psychopaths in different professions happen to be in business, and particularly CEOs of corporations. In some cases, they're absolutely wonderful people. Like Bill Gates is certainly not a psychopath. He's extremely generous and has a tremendous amount of empathy for everybody. But there are some others that, they'll build big towers and put their name all over everything, and make racist remarks about Muslims or Mexicans and all that kind of stuff. Not mentioning any names or anything, but I'm just saying that there's some people like that seem to be more likely to be psychopaths than certainly many others. Here are the symptoms of psychopaths. One that's most telling is the last one of these, and that is the lack of remorse after having hurt someone or mistreated somebody or stealing from someone. These folks can rip off people and not feel bad at all. They just think, well, it's their own fault for being so stupid. They seem to lack any kind of remorse for hurting people. What he does is he takes people from Mascouy out to UBC, and he puts them into brain imaging machines, and then he shows them disturbing pictures. And when the person sees this disturbing picture, if they have a normal brain like the one at the top, the middle of the picture there you can see is all red, and that's right in the middle of in the brain there. That's the limbic area, which is where emotions are processed. And so that person is feeling a lot of empathy or fear or something. They feel a lot of emotion for this picture that they're looking at. So if it's a disturbing picture, these people would have empathy for the person. For example, Dr. Hare, when he's giving these talks, shows some very disturbing pictures that, he'll show a picture that he gets from the RCMP or the CIA or the FBI of somebody's head who has been beaten flat as a pancake with a baseball bat and things like that. And I don't have any of those pictures, but he is able to get a hold of them from his friends in the FBI and the CIA because he does a lot of work with them on psychopathology. And so some of his pictures are very disturbing, and you can see right away what's going on there with the brain. The bottom picture is a psychopathic brain. That person can look at the same picture as the person at the top, and because they're psychopathic, the brain just doesn't react the same way at all. So I have a disturbing picture here, but I'm a little concerned about showing it, so I'm going to count to 3 and then I want you to close your eyes, and then I'll come back to it, okay, to another one. Okay, so ready? 1, 2, 3, close your eyes. Okay, some of you didn't close your eyes, but anyway, this isn't the disturbing picture, of course. This will make your brain light up in the same areas, the emotional areas of the brain, but in a different way. Now, I do have a disturbing picture here, though, and this is one that's been in the newspaper. It's not as disturbing as the one Dr. Hare shows his pictures in his talks, but it's very disturbing to me. And if this is disturbing, just turn away. This is a picture of a little girl in the Sudan back in 1994. She's crawling towards a United Nations feeding station. She's starving to death. There's a tremendous famine on in that year, and a lot of people are dying. This photographer was over there from one of the major magazines taking pictures to send back to his publisher to show the famine and try and get some help and relief over there. He took this picture of this little girl, and then as he was finishing up the picture, this vulture landed behind this little girl. So he took another picture. They'd been instructed by the United Nations not to interfere with this because these kids were dying, and what they were told was these kids are going to die anyway. So just you can't do anything to help. If you help them, you're liable to touch them, and if you touch them, you will get the same diseases they've got, and it will probably kill you because you don't have the immunity to that they have, or else they'll die. You'll die anyway because they're going to die. They were told that these kids are beyond help. They're going to die, so just let them die. You can't do anything to help. Just report the story and let the world come to do something about the famine. That was the idea. This fellow took the picture and then left because he was told that's what he should do. 2 hours later, he's back at the station, and he just can't live with himself. He's just beside himself, and he thought, who the hell am I kidding myself? I can't do this. I got to go back and find that kid and help her. So he went back, and he couldn't find that little girl. So he was really, really distraught. A couple of months later, he won the Pulitzer Prize for that photograph, and was just incredibly depressed because he hadn't done anything to help that kid. And a few months after that, he wound up taking his own life, which is a very, very sad tragedy all the way around. But anyway, that's what happened, mainly because he couldn't live with himself because of the fact that he'd ignored that little girl. So he had tremendous empathy. And if you'd looked at his brain, looking at that scene, it would have looked like the top one here. And a lot of other people, not a lot of, but a few other people, might have looked like the bottom picture there because they wouldn't have that empathy for that little girl. So that's the work that he did. Martha Stout says that she believes that whether or not somebody becomes a psychopath depends upon the culture they grow up in. In other words, there are epigenetic effects here. If you grow up in a we culture, if you have the genes for psychopathology, they don't get turned on. But if you grow up in a me-centered culture, they do get turned on. And she says that we have to be very careful because if we're becoming, what she says is that the United States has become very much a me kind of a culture. Canada much less so. In fact, she says 1 in 25 Americans secretly has no conscience and can do almost anything without feeling guilty, which is psychopathology. 1 out of 25 in Canada, 1 out of 100. So she's saying there are more American psychopaths than there are Canadians. But if you go to India and China, you'll find out it's less than Canada because they have very much a we-centered culture. When Katrina hit the United States, they had armed helicopters flying all over the area trying to protect things. When the big tsunami hit Japan, they didn't have to have helicopters protecting anything. Nobody over there would even dream of stealing from somebody after they'd had a tsunami go through their village. They're very much a we-centered culture, and they wouldn't think of doing that. So that's kind of what Martha says. This is epigenetics. You grow up in a selfish, me-centered society, you wind up psychopathic if you've got the genes for it. If you grow up in a we-centered culture, that doesn't happen. So what you like to do is just realize that we've got some work here to do. Just think about the implications of this research on epigenetics for us in our work with kids and with parents. What do we have to do to make sure that we have this we-centered culture rather than the me-centered cultures? Unfortunately, I think in Canada we're becoming more me-centered as we have so much influence on television from countries where there is an awful lot of this me rather than we. So think about those in your work. Thank you.